As Jim Henderson began clearing away the rotted boards and rusted metal sheets from his collapsed storage shed, something caught his eye, an unusual glint of metal peeking through the disturbed soil. Brushing away decades of packed earth with trembling hands, he lifted out what appeared to be an intricately decorated medallion, unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Looking closer at the disturbed ground, he could see more objects partially exposed by the collapse, their mysterious shapes hinting at secrets long buried beneath his family's farm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the debris-strewn yard as Jim crouched down for a better look. The medallion was heavy in his palm, its surface covered in strange markings that didn't quite match any historical period he was familiar with. As a third-generation farmer in the Shenandoah Valley, Jim had found his fair share of old coins, rusty tools, and even the occasional Civil War bullet while working his fields. But this was different. The storage shed had stood on this spot for as long as he could remember. His grandfather had used it to store tobacco before the family switched to growing corn and soybeans in the 1960s. Now, its collapse during last night's violent storm seemed almost purposeful, as if the earth itself had chosen this moment to reveal its secrets. Jim's weathered hands shook slightly as he carefully brushed more soil away from the area where he'd found the medallion. More objects emerged, peculiar ceramic fragments with unfamiliar patterns, what looked like ceremonial items, and several more medallions, each one different from the last. The objects seemed to form a deliberate arrangement, not the random scatter of lost or discarded items. The discovery couldn't have come at a more critical time for the Henderson farm. The past few years had been brutal, with drought conditions and rising costs pushing the operation to its financial limits. Just last week, Jim had been sitting at his kitchen table, staring at mounting bills and wondering if he'd be the one to finally break the family's farming legacy. His son, Michael, had already left for college in Richmond, showing no interest in carrying on the farming tradition. The bank had been making noise about loan payments, and Jim had started to consider the unthinkable, selling off parts of the land. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Jim's mind raced with possibilities. Having majored in history before returning to take over the family farm, he knew enough to recognize that these items didn't fit the usual pattern of colonial or Native American artifacts commonly found in the valley. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and the symbols, they were like nothing he'd ever encountered in his studies. Reaching for his phone, Jim's first instinct was to call his old college roommate, Dr. Thomas Walker, now a professor of archaeology at the University of Virginia. But as his finger hovered over the contact, he hesitated. Stories of artifact looting and archaeological site destruction had made headlines in recent years. If this was as significant as he suspected, he needed to handle it properly. Instead, Jim carefully photographed everything in place, using his trusty work gloves to clear away more debris. The collapsed shed had revealed what appeared to be the corner of some kind of underground structure. The medallions and other objects were arranged around its edge in a way that suggested ritual significance rather than random burial. As darkness approached, Jim reluctantly covered the site with a tarp, weighing it down with stones. His mind was spinning with questions. How old were these artifacts? Who had buried them here? And why? The farm had been in his family since 1889, when his great-grandfather purchased it from the Whitaker family, who'd owned it since colonial times. But these items didn't look colonial. They seemed both older and more sophisticated. That night, Jim could hardly sleep. He kept thinking about the strange symbols on the medallions, the unusual materials, the precise arrangement of the objects. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those intricate patterns teasing him with their unknown meaning. The weight of the discovery pressed on him. This could be more than just some interesting historical finds. This could be something that would make historians reconsider everything they thought they knew about early American history. As he lay in bed listening to the creaks and groans of his old farmhouse, Jim thought about all the generations that had walked this land before him. His grandfather used to tell stories about the original settlers, about the legends of the valley, about the mysterious lights people sometimes reported seeing in the hills. He'd always dismissed those tales as local folklore, but now, morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first rays of sun crept over the mountains, Jim was already back at the site, this time with proper documentation materials, a measuring tape, graph paper, and his digital camera. He needed to record everything precisely before bringing in the experts. Whatever these artifacts were, they had chosen his land to reveal themselves, and he was determined to handle their discovery with the respect it deserved. Little did Jim know that this morning marked the beginning of a journey that would not only transform his life, but potentially rewrite the history books. As he carefully documented each item, each pattern, each position, he couldn't possibly imagine how these mysterious objects would soon attract attention from the highest levels of the archaeological community, or how they would ultimately save much more than just his struggling farm. A soft breeze rustled through the autumn leaves as Jim continued his careful work, the morning sun gradually revealing more glints of metal and pottery in the disturbed earth. Something extraordinary had been waiting here for generations, buried beneath the mundane activities of daily farm life. Now, its time had finally come to be discovered. The Henderson family farm had always been more than just land to Jim. It was his heritage, his identity, and until recently, his son Michael's presumed future. Situated in Virginia's picturesque Shenandoah Valley, the sprawling 180-acre property had weathered everything from the Great Depression to multiple droughts since his great-grandfather first acquired it in 1889. The farm's white colonial-style house, with its wraparound porch and weather-worn shutters, had watched over generations of Hendersons as they worked the fertile valley soil. Jim hadn't always planned to be a farmer. In his youth, his passion for history had led him to the University of Virginia, where he'd excelled in archaeological studies. His dorm room walls had been covered with maps of ancient civilizations and Native American settlements. He'd dreamed of traveling the world, uncovering lost cities and forgotten cultures. But life had other plans. During his senior year, his father's sudden heart attack had brought him back to the farm, trading his archaeology textbooks for agricultural almanacs and equipment manuals. That was 28 years ago. Now at 50, Jim's hands bore the calluses of countless seasons of planting and harvest, his face weathered by years of working under the valley's sun. The transition hadn't been easy, but he'd managed to modernize the farm while preserving its heritage. He'd introduced sustainable farming practices, invested in more efficient irrigation systems, and even experimented with organic crops to tap into growing market demands. But the past 5 years had brought unprecedented challenges. Climate change had made weather patterns increasingly unpredictable, with last year's drought followed by this year's excessive rainfall. The rising costs of fertilizer and equipment maintenance had eaten into their already thin profit margins. The massive agricultural corporations moving into the valley hadn't helped either, their industrial-scale operations driving down crop prices and making it nearly impossible for family farms to compete. The kitchen table in the Henderson farmhouse had become a battlefield of sorts, covered in past due notices, bank statements, and loan documentation. Jim spent his evenings there, calculator in hand, trying to find a way to make the numbers work. The property tax bills kept climbing while crop yields remained unstable. The ancient irrigation system needed expensive repairs, and the barn roof wouldn't make it through another winter without major work. What hurt most was the change in his relationship with his son. Michael, now a sophomore studying computer science at Virginia Tech, had grown increasingly distant from the farm and its traditions. Their last conversation about the farm's future had ended in an argument, with Michael declaring he had no intention of throwing away his life, maintaining a failing business. The words had cut deep, not just because they challenged Jim's life choices, but because they echoed his own abandoned dreams of archaeological discovery. Sarah, Jim's wife, had been teaching extra classes at the local high school to help make ends meet. She never complained, but Jim could see the worry in her eyes each time she looked at their dwindling savings account. They'd already refinanced the farm twice, and the bank had made it clear that a third time wasn't an option. The property developers who'd been buying up failing farms in the valley had started sending him letters, their offers becoming increasingly tempting as their financial situation worsened. The irony wasn't lost on Jim, that his education in archaeology might have prepared him better for discovering historical artifacts than running a modern farm. He still subscribed to archaeological journals, reading them late at night after finishing his farm work, living vicariously through the discoveries of others. His old college roommate, Dr. Thomas Walker, now a prominent archaeologist, occasionally sent him updates about his latest digs and discoveries. Each email was a bittersweet reminder of the path not taken. The farm's current struggles weren't just about money, they represented the potential end of a legacy. The Henderson farm had been a cornerstone of the local community for generations. Jim's grandfather had helped establish the local agricultural cooperative, and his father had served on the county's agricultural board for 2 decades. The annual Henderson Farm Fall Festival had been a community tradition for over 40 years, drawing families from across the valley to celebrate the harvest season. Every morning, as Jim walked the property doing his daily checks, he'd pass the old family cemetery where 4 generations of Hendersons rested beneath ancient oak trees. The weight of their legacy pressed heavily on his shoulders. How could he be the one to lose everything they'd built? The thought of being the last Henderson to work this land haunted his sleepless nights. The collapsed storage shed had been just another symbol of the farm's decline. Built by his grandfather in the 1940s, it had stored everything from tobacco to hay over the years. Jim had been meaning to repair it for the past 3 seasons, but there was never enough money or time. Now, as he looked at the mysterious artifacts emerging from beneath its foundation, he couldn't help but wonder if this discovery was fate's way of intervening. Years ago, his grandfather used to tell stories about the land's history, tales of strange lights in the valley, and mysterious findings by the early settlers. Jim had always dismissed these as local folklore, the kind of stories that every farming community accumulated over generations. But now, standing amid the shed's ruins with an ancient medallion in his hand, those old stories took on new significance. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Shenandoah Valley, Jim Henderson sat at his worn kitchen table, the mysterious medallion placed carefully on a clean cloth before him. Steam rose from his untouched coffee as he struggled with the weight of his discovery. The news was full of stories about archaeological finds being looted or damaged before experts could properly document them. One wrong move could destroy valuable historical evidence, or worse, get him into legal trouble that could further threaten his already precarious situation. His fingers traced the strange symbols on the medallion's surface, feeling the precision of craftsmanship that had somehow survived centuries buried in the Virginia soil. The thought of proper archaeological documentation reminded him of his college days, of careful grid mapping and meticulous note-taking. But this wasn't a controlled academic excavation. This was his land, his livelihood, and possibly his last chance to save everything his family had built. Sarah entered the kitchen, still in her teaching clothes from the morning's early staff meeting. She stopped short when she saw the peculiar object on the table. "Jim? What is that?" Her voice carried a mix of curiosity and concern. As he explained the morning's discovery, her expression shifted from skepticism to cautious excitement. After 25 years of marriage, she knew her husband well enough to recognize when something was truly extraordinary. "You need to call Tom," she said firmly, referring to his old college roommate Dr. Walker. "This isn't like finding old horseshoes or Civil War bullets in the fields. Whatever this is, it looks different." She was right, of course. The craftsmanship of the medallion and the other artifacts he'd glimpsed suggested something far more significant than typical colonial or Native American finds. Jim pulled out his phone and pulled up Dr. Walker's contact information for the 3rd time that morning. His thumb hovered over the call button as he weighed his options. The responsible choice would be to report the find immediately and let professional archaeologists take over. But years of struggling to keep the farm afloat had taught him that the responsible choice didn't always lead to the best outcome for his family. Stories circulated in farming communities about significant discoveries being made on private land. Some landowners had managed to leverage their finds into profitable tourist attractions or museums. Others had lost control of their property entirely to lengthy archaeological surveys and government oversight. The law regarding archaeological finds on private property was complex, varying by state and the nature of the discovery. Jim's mind wandered to the stack of bills in his office drawer. The bank's latest letter had made it clear. They needed to make a substantial payment within the next 3 months or face foreclosure proceedings. The property developer's offers to buy the farm were looking more inevitable with each passing day. Could these artifacts provide a way out, or would involving authorities just accelerate their financial doom? He thought about Michael, away at college, pursuing his dreams of a life beyond the farm. Despite their recent arguments, Jim understood his son's desire for a different path, but the thought of losing the family legacy still cut deep. Whatever decision he made now would affect not just the farm's immediate future, but its entire legacy. Rising from the table, Jim walked to the window. From here, he could see the tarp-covered site where more artifacts lay waiting to be uncovered. The morning breeze gently lifted the tarp's corners, as if teasing him with glimpses of what lay beneath. The rational part of his mind knew that disturbing an archaeological site without proper expertise could destroy valuable historical context. His old professors would be horrified at the thought. Sarah's hand on his shoulder interrupted his thoughts. "You're thinking about trying to handle this yourself, aren't you?" There was no judgment in her voice, just understanding. She'd stood by him through every difficult decision, every failed crop, every financial setback. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But remember why you loved history in the first place. It wasn't about money or fame." Her words struck home. Jim remembered the excitement he'd felt as a student, learning about how each careful discovery added to humanity's understanding of its past. The artifacts under that tarp weren't just potential financial salvation. They were pieces of history that had chosen this moment, this place, to emerge. Walking to his office, Jim retrieved his old college notebooks from a dusty box in the corner. The pages were filled with detailed notes about archaeological methods, site documentation, and preservation techniques. If he was going to do this, he would do it right. He might not be a professional archaeologist, but he had the training to at least document everything properly before bringing in the experts. Taking a deep breath, Jim made his decision. He would spend one day, just one, carefully documenting everything he could find. He would photograph, measure, and map the site using his old archaeological training. Then, with evidence in hand, he would contact Dr. Walker. This way, he would have a clear picture of what he was dealing with before potentially losing control of the situation. "I need your help," he told Sarah, who nodded in immediate understanding. As a science teacher, she had a methodical mind and steady hands. Together, they could document the site more efficiently and with less risk of disturbing important details. Jim gathered his supplies, his digital camera, measuring tape, graph paper, and the few archaeological tools he'd kept from his college days. He even found his old North Arrow and scale bar for photographic documentation. The familiar feel of these tools in his hands brought back memories of field schools and the excitement of discovery. The decision made, Jim felt a curious mix of relief and anxiety. He knew this choice walked a fine line between responsibility and recklessness, between preserving history and protecting his family's future. But something about these artifacts, about their precise arrangement and unusual craftsmanship, told him this discovery was different from anything previously found in the valley. Armed with his old archaeological tools and Sarah's steady assistance, Jim approached the tarp-covered site with a mixture of academic precision and barely contained excitement. The morning dew still clung to the grass as they carefully removed the protective covering, revealing once again the glint of mysterious artifacts in the disturbed soil. Sarah gasped softly at her first proper look at the discovery, her trained scientific mind already cataloging details. "We should establish a grid system first," Jim said, falling naturally back into the methodical approach he'd learned in college. Using string and wooden stakes from his garden shed, they created a 1-meter grid over the exposed area. The collapsed storage shed had revealed approximately 16 square meters of what appeared to be some kind of structured deposit, far more extensive than Jim had initially realized. Sarah began photographing each grid square methodically while Jim sketched a preliminary site map. The medallion he'd found yesterday was just the beginning. As the morning light improved, they could see dozens of artifacts arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. The objects seemed to radiate outward from a central point like spokes on a wheel. "Jim, look at this," Sarah called, kneeling beside one of the grid squares. She'd brushed away some loose soil to reveal what appeared to be a stone tablet, its surface covered in the same unusual symbols as the medallion. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The symbols weren't merely carved, but seemed to be inlaid with some kind of metallic material that still retained its luster despite centuries underground. As they worked, Jim documented everything in his field notebook, his handwriting growing increasingly excited as the magnitude of their discovery became clear. The artifacts weren't randomly scattered but appeared to be part of a carefully constructed arrangement. There were more medallions, each unique but sharing similar design elements. Interspersed among them were small statues made of an unidentifiable dark metal, their surfaces decorated with intricate geometric patterns. "This isn't colonial," Sarah murmured, carefully cleaning one of the smaller artifacts with a soft brush. "And it doesn't match any Native American artifacts I've ever seen in the local museums." Her years of teaching Virginia history had made her familiar with the region's archaeological heritage. "These pieces, they're different. The metallurgy alone seems far too advanced." By midday, they had documented 8 distinct types of artifacts. 1. The medallions, each approximately 6 inches in diameter, made of an unusually heavy metal. 2. Small statues depicting what appeared to be humanoid figures with elaborate headdresses. 3. Stone tablets with inlaid symbolic writing. 4. Ceramic vessels with geometric patterns that seemed to glow faintly when sunlight hit them at certain angles. 5. Metal tools of unknown purpose, their handles wrapped in perfectly preserved leather. 6. Crystal-like objects that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. 7. What appeared to be astronomical devices, with moving parts still functioning after centuries. Buried. 8. Several small boxes made of an unknown material, sealed so perfectly they couldn't be opened. As Jim photographed a particularly intricate statue, he noticed something odd about its base. "Sarah, come look at this." The bottom of the statue contained what appeared to be a map, but not of any geography he recognized. The detailed lines and symbols suggested a sophisticated understanding of cartography, but the land masses depicted didn't correspond to any known continent. The temperature began to rise as the sun climbed higher, but neither Jim nor Sarah noticed their growing thirst or hunger. They were too absorbed in their documentation, each new discovery raising more questions than answers. The precision of the artifact's arrangement suggested this wasn't a random storage site or trash deposit. It had all the hallmarks of a deliberately constructed feature. "We need to measure the depth," Jim decided, carefully using a small trowel to expose the edge of one artifact cluster. The soil changed color and texture about 30 centimeters down, suggesting the artifacts had been placed in a purposefully dug pit. But the soil stratification was odd. There were no clear layers as one would expect from centuries of natural deposition. Sarah, who had been photographing another section, suddenly called out in surprise, "Jim, you need to see this." She had uncovered what appeared to be a complete medallion sequence, 5 pieces arranged in a perfect arc. Each medallion seemed to tell part of a story through its symbols, and together they created what looked like a coherent narrative. But it was the material itself that caught Jim's attention. Under the bright sunlight, the metal seemed to shift color slightly, displaying properties he'd never seen before. As they documented this new find, a distant rumble of thunder reminded them of the approaching afternoon storms typical of Virginia summers. They would need to wrap up soon to protect the site from the rain. Jim felt a growing anxiety. They had only scratched the surface of what was here, and already the discoveries defied explanation. The last hour of their documentation focused on creating detailed sketches of the symbolic writing they'd found. Sarah, with her artistic background, carefully copied the intricate patterns while Jim measured and photographed each piece. The symbols seemed to follow a consistent pattern, suggesting a developed writing system rather than mere decorative elements. Just as they were preparing to cover the site again, Jim's trowel clinked against something solid at the bottom of their test area. Carefully brushing away the soil, he revealed what appeared to be a smooth metallic surface extending deeper into the ground. It was cool to the touch, despite the hot sun, and seemed to be part of a larger structure. "We can't excavate any deeper without proper equipment and expertise," Jim said reluctantly, though every fiber of his being wanted to continue. Sarah nodded in agreement, helping him carefully backfill the small test area they had cleared. They had documented enough to prove this was no ordinary archaeological site, but the discovery of the underground structure added a new level of complexity to their find. As they secured the tarp against the approaching storm, Jim's mind raced with implications. The sophistication of the artifacts, their unusual properties, and the precision of their arrangement all pointed to something unprecedented in North American archaeology. The question was no longer just about preserving his family's farm. He had stumbled onto something that could potentially rewrite history. The first signs of trouble came 3 days after Jim and Sarah's careful documentation of the site. The morning began with an unusual number of unfamiliar vehicles driving slowly past the farm, their occupants clearly interested in the tarp-covered area near the collapsed shed. Jim had hoped to keep the discovery quiet until he could contact Dr. Walker with their complete findings, but rumors spread quickly in small farming communities. By mid-morning, his cell phone was buzzing constantly with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Local news vans had started parking at the end of his driveway, their satellite dishes raised hopefully toward the sky. Someone, Jim suspected one of the teenage farmhands who'd overheard him talking to Sarah, had posted about the discovery on social media, and the story had spread like wildfire through the valley. "We've got another problem," Sarah said, returning from her morning classes at the high school. She handed Jim a local newspaper. There, on the front page, was a grainy photo of their tarp-covered site, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from the neighboring property. The headline read, "Mysterious artifacts found on struggling local farm, ancient treasure or elaborate hoax." Jim's hands trembled as he read the article. It was filled with speculation and quotes from self-proclaimed experts who hadn't even seen the artifacts. Worse, it mentioned the farm's financial troubles and suggested that the timing of the discovery was suspiciously convenient. The article even quoted their son Michael's old social media posts about the farm's problems, painting a picture of desperate farmers who might fake an archaeological discovery to save their property. As if the media attention wasn't enough, Jim's phone lit up with a call from Marcus Bennett, the bank manager handling their loan. "Mr. Henderson," Bennett's voice was cool and professional, "we need to discuss how this situation affects your property's status. Any significant archaeological find could impact the land's development potential, and by extension, its value as collateral." The implications were clear. If the discovery was real, the bank might accelerate their loan demands, fearing that archaeological preservation orders could reduce the property's value. If it was proved fake, they'd be in even worse trouble. Jim felt the walls closing in around him, his careful plans crumbling. That afternoon, things got even more complicated. A group of people identifying themselves as independent archaeological researchers showed up unannounced, demanding to see the site. When Jim refused, they became confrontational, claiming they had a right to investigate potential historical discoveries. It took Sarah's calm intervention and a call to the local sheriff to make them leave, but the sheriff's visit brought its own problems. "Jim," Sheriff Davidson said quietly, after dispersing the unwanted visitors, "I've known you since high school, so I'm giving you a heads up. The State Archaeological Board has been contacted. They're sending someone tomorrow to assess the situation. You need to make sure everything here is by the book." The pressure was building from all sides. Jim retreated to his office, trying to think clearly through his options. The careful documentation he and Sarah had created now seemed insufficient in the face of official scrutiny. What if they had inadvertently damaged something important in their initial investigation? What if their amateur documentation methods had compromised the site's scientific value? Later that evening, As they sat at the kitchen table reviewing their notes and photographs, Sarah noticed something that made their situation even more precarious. In their excitement over the artifacts, they had failed to properly document the exact condition of the site immediately after the shed's collapse. Without that crucial initial documentation, they had no way to prove they hadn't disturbed the original arrangement of the artifacts. "We should have called the experts immediately," Sarah whispered, voicing the fear that had been growing in Jim's mind. "What if we've ruined everything by trying to handle this ourselves?" The stress of the situation began to take its toll. Jim developed a splitting headache that wouldn't go away, and his hands shook slightly as he reviewed their documentation. Sarah noticed him rubbing his chest occasionally, a gesture reminiscent of his father's habits before his fatal heart attack. The weight of their decisions, the public scrutiny, and the increasing pressure from all sides were becoming overwhelming. That night, a severe thunderstorm rolled through the valley. Jim lay awake, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, worried about whether their makeshift covering would protect the site adequately. Around midnight, a particularly violent gust of wind ripped the tarp loose. Jim rushed out into the storm to secure it, getting soaked to the skin in the process. By morning, he was running a high fever. Sarah found him shivering in his office, surrounded by scattered photographs and notes, trying desperately to organize everything before the State Archaeological Board's arrival. His normally steady handwriting had become shaky, and he was having trouble focusing on the documents in front of him. "You need to rest," Sarah insisted, feeling his forehead. "You're burning up." But Jim refused to lie down. There was too much at stake, too many things that needed to be explained and documented properly. The fate of the farm, their family's legacy, and potentially significant historical artifacts all hung in the balance. As the morning progressed, Jim's condition worsened. The fever climbed higher, and his breathing became labored. Sarah watched with growing alarm as he struggled to maintain his composure during a phone call with their lawyer, his words becoming increasingly confused and disjointed. Finally, during a meeting with Sheriff Davidson about security arrangements for the site, Jim collapsed. The room spun around him, voices becoming distant and distorted. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Sarah's terrified face as she called for an ambulance. The emergency room at Shenandoah Valley General Hospital buzzed with activity as Jim drifted in and out of consciousness. The diagnosis was severe pneumonia, complicated by exhaustion and stress. As Sarah sat by his hospital bed, holding his fevered hand, she faced an impossible situation: how to protect both her husband and the unprecedented discovery on their land. Dr. Elena Martinez, Jim's primary physician, didn't mince words. "He's pushed himself too far," she explained, reviewing Jim's vitals on the monitor. "The combination of physical exhaustion, stress, and exposure to the elements has overwhelmed his immune system. He needs complete rest, at least a week in the hospital, possibly more." Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, archaeological officials, and concerned neighbors. The State Archaeological Board representatives were due to arrive at the farm in less than 2 hours, and there was no way she could be in 2 places at once. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, an unexpected cavalry arrived in the form of Robert Bobby Chen, Jim's oldest friend, and the local high school's history teacher. The support extended beyond just practical help. The local minister organized a prayer circle, local school children made get-well cards, and the farmers' market vendors put together care packages for both the hospital room and the archaeological team working on the farm. Dr. Martinez noted the improvement in Jim's vital signs as he absorbed these stories of community support. "Sometimes the best medicine isn't what we prescribe," she observed. "It's knowing you're not alone." The breakthrough came on a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 10 days after Jim's hospitalization. Lily Chen had been cross-referencing their documentation with archaeological databases when she noticed something extraordinary about the geometric patterns on the artifacts. She was working late in the makeshift research center they'd set up in the Henderson's barn, surrounded by photographs, drawings, and digital scanning equipment provided by the State Archaeological Board. "Mom, look at this," she called to Grace, who was cataloging photographs nearby. Lily's hands trembled as she pulled up a series of images on her laptop. These patterns aren't just decorative. They're mathematical sequences, and they're incredibly complex. Grace leaned in, her museum curator's eye taking in the details her daughter was highlighting. The geometric designs that wrapped around the medallions and statues weren't random or purely aesthetic. They appeared to be representing mathematical concepts far more advanced than anything previously found in ancient American artifacts. Dr. Rebecca Whitman from the State Board was still on site, working late as she often did since the discovery. She joined them at the computer, her expression shifting from professional interest to barely contained excitement as Lily explained her findings. The patterns appeared to describe astronomical calculations, including what looked like precise measurements of celestial movements. "We need to get someone from the mathematics department to verify this," Dr. Whitman said, already pulling out her phone. Despite the late hour, she placed a call to Dr. James Liu, a prominent mathematician at the University of Virginia who specialized in ancient mathematical systems. While they waited for Dr. Liu to analyze the photos they sent, the team continued examining the artifacts with this new mathematical perspective. Sarah, who had stopped by the barn after visiting Jim at the hospital, found her science teacher's background particularly useful in recognizing some of the patterns. "These look like wave functions," she said, pointing to a series of curved lines on one of the tablets. "Similar to what we use to describe quantum mechanics, but that's impossible, isn't it?" The next morning, Dr. Liu arrived at the farm practically vibrating with excitement. He'd spent the entire night analyzing the photographs, and his findings were astonishing. "These aren't just mathematical formulas," he explained to the assembled team. "They're expressions of advanced theoretical physics concepts that we've only understood in the last century." He spread out his notes on the large table they'd set up in the barn. "Look at this sequence here," he pointed to one of the medallions. "It appears to be describing wave-particle duality, a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics. And this pattern? It's remarkably similar to equations we use to describe space-time curvature in Einstein's theory of relativity." The implications were staggering. Either someone had perpetrated an incredibly sophisticated hoax, or they were looking at evidence that advanced scientific knowledge had existed in North America long before European contact. The carbon dating results from the organic materials found with the artifacts had placed them at approximately 1,200 years old, centuries before Columbus. Michael, who had been recording all the findings in a detailed database, raised an important point. "The precision of these patterns is incredible," he said, zooming in on one of the high-resolution photographs. "The spacing between lines is exactly the same across all the artifacts, down to the microscopic level. Even with modern technology, this would be extremely difficult to achieve." As the team processed these revelations, Sarah received a call from the hospital. Jim's condition had improved significantly, and he was being moved out of intensive care. The doctors had agreed he could have an extended visit from the research team to hear about their findings firsthand. That afternoon, they gathered in Jim's hospital room, where Dr. Whitman, Dr. Liu, and Lily presented their discoveries. Jim sat up in his bed, color returning to his face as he listened to their explanations. The revelation that he had discovered something potentially revolutionary in the history of human knowledge seemed to accelerate his recovery. "There's more," Lily said, pulling out her tablet. "We've been analyzing the arrangement of the artifacts themselves. They weren't just placed randomly. They form a precise geometric pattern. When we mapped it out, we realized it's a scaled representation of specific star configurations." Dr. Liu nodded enthusiastically. "The positioning appears to mark astronomical alignments that would have been visible from this exact location approximately 1,200 years ago. The level of astronomical knowledge required to create this arrangement is remarkable." The metallic surface they had found extending deeper into the ground also took on new significance. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, authorized by the State Board, had revealed that it was part of a larger structured installation. The mathematical patterns appeared to radiate outward from this central point. "Whatever this site is," Dr. Whitman explained, "it appears to be much more significant than a simple artifact deposit. The precision of the arrangement, the advanced mathematical knowledge encoded in the artifacts, and the sophisticated construction techniques all suggest this was a deliberately created scientific installation. Jim absorbed this information with growing amazement. The mysterious artifacts he'd discovered weren't just historically significant. They potentially represented a completely unknown chapter in human scientific development. His family's farm, which he'd feared losing to foreclosure, might now be one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. Sarah sat beside his bed, holding his hand as they looked at the images and diagrams the team had prepared. The relief and joy on Jim's face matched the excitement of the researchers. After years of struggling to keep the farm afloat, after nearly losing everything, they had stumbled upon something beyond their wildest expectations. Dr. Whitman cleared her throat, preparing to share one final piece of news. The Smithsonian Institution has expressed serious interest in the site, she announced. They're preparing to send a team of their top researchers. This discovery, it could change everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian science and technology in North America. The arrival of the Smithsonian team transformed the Henderson farm into something resembling a high-tech research facility almost overnight. Dr. Catherine Morrison, the institution's lead archaeologist for North American studies, arrived with a team of 12 specialists in a convoy of vehicles that kicked up dust along the farm's gravel driveway. The sight was almost comical. Cutting-edge laboratory equipment being carefully unloaded next to old tractors and hay bales, as world-renowned scientists navigated around curious farm cats and clucking chickens. Jim, finally released from the hospital but still recovering, watched from the farmhouse porch as the experts began their work. Wrapped in a warm blanket, despite the mild weather with Sarah beside him, he observed the transformation of his family farm into what looked more like a NASA research station than an agricultural operation. Their old barn, which had stored generations of farming equipment, now housed millions of dollars worth of sophisticated testing equipment. Dr. Morrison approached the porch to introduce herself, her commanding presence softened by the genuine excitement in her eyes. "Mr. Henderson," she said, settling into a chair next to him, "I want you to understand the magnitude of what you've discovered here." She pulled out a tablet, showing him preliminary analysis results that made even Sarah, with her science background, gasp in amazement. "The metal alloy used in these artifacts," she explained, pointing to microscopic images, "shows manufacturing techniques that shouldn't have been possible 1,200 years ago. The molecular structure suggests a level of metallurgical understanding that wouldn't be achieved again until the modern era." Dr. Victor Patel, the team's metallurgist, joined them on the porch, his usual scientific reserve cracking with barely contained enthusiasm. "We've identified at least 3 distinct alloy compositions," he explained, pulling up detailed spectroscopic analyses. "Each one appears to have been engineered for specific properties: electrical conductivity, magnetic response, and something we're still trying to understand. The level of purification required for these metals, it's beyond what most modern facilities can achieve." Throughout that first day, a parade of specialists shared their findings, each more extraordinary than the last. Dr. Sarah Chen, their quantum physicist, had been analyzing the mathematical patterns Lily had initially identified. She spread out a series of diagrams across the porch table, her hands shaking with excitement. "These aren't just representations of advanced physics concepts," she explained, tracing the intricate patterns. "They appear to be instructions, a scientific manual encoded in geometric patterns. Look here." She pointed to a particular sequence. "This exactly describes quantum entanglement principles we only confirmed experimentally in the last few decades. And this section? It could be depicting concepts we're still theorizing about in string theory." The linguistic team, led by Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, had made remarkable progress with the symbolic writing system. Their analysis revealed a complex but logical structure that combined mathematical precision with linguistic elements. "It's like they developed a language specifically designed to convey scientific concepts," he explained, showing them computer models of the symbol patterns. "The precision is extraordinary. Each symbol appears to have multiple layers of meaning, depending on its context and position." As the afternoon progressed, more specialists arrived. Dr. Elena Volkov, their geological expert, had brought ground-penetrating radar equipment that revealed astonishing details about the structure beneath the site. The three-dimensional renderings showed a carefully constructed underground chamber, its walls containing the same unusual alloy as the artifacts. The entire structure appeared to have been designed to align with specific astronomical events. The astronomical team, led by Dr. James Wright, had set up sophisticated modeling software in the barn. Their analysis confirmed and expanded upon Lily's initial observation about the star alignments. The artifact arrangement doesn't just map celestial positions, Dr. Wright explained, showing them a computer simulation. It appears to be calculating orbital mechanics with incredible precision. They understood cosmic movements we didn't confirm until Kepler and Newton. Around sunset, Dr. Morrison gathered everyone in the barn for a comprehensive briefing. The Henderson farm, she explained, had become the center of what might be the most significant archaeological discovery in North American history. The evidence suggested they had found something far beyond a simple artifact deposit. They were looking at what appeared to be an ancient scientific research installation. The implications are staggering, Dr. Morrison continued, her voice echoing in the converted barn. The mathematical and scientific concepts represented here rival or exceed what Europeans would discover centuries later. We're seeing evidence of understanding in quantum mechanics, celestial mathematics, and metallurgy that shouldn't have been possible at this time in history. The material analysis team had made particularly fascinating discoveries. Dr. Amanda Foster, their material scientist, shared electron microscope images showing nanoscale structures in the artifacts. These patterns aren't random, she explained. They're engineered at a molecular level. The precision and consistency across all the artifacts suggest manufacturing capabilities we can barely match today. Dr. Rodriguez's linguistic team had begun mapping connections between the symbols and their scientific meanings. We've identified what appears to be a kind of periodic table, he announced, displaying their findings. But it contains elements we didn't isolate until the modern era. They knew about atomic structure over a millennium ago, and possibly understood it better than we do now. The validation from these top experts transformed the atmosphere on the farm. The local media's initial skepticism about a convenient discovery on a struggling farm had given way to international attention. News crews from major networks were now stationed at the end of the driveway, held back by a security team provided by the Smithsonian. Dr. Morrison addressed the practical aspects as well. Mr. Henderson, she said, turning to Jim and Sarah, the Smithsonian Institution wants to establish a permanent research facility here. We're prepared to offer substantial funding for long-term study of the site. This would include provisions for maintaining the working farm, while protecting and studying the archaeological features. The morning after the Smithsonian team's initial briefing, Jim and Sarah sat at their kitchen table with Dr. Morrison and a team of institutional representatives. The familiar surface where they'd once spread out overdue bills and bank notices now held contract proposals and development plans. The contrast wasn't lost on Jim, who couldn't help but smile at the irony. Let me outline what the Smithsonian is proposing, Dr. Morrison began, spreading out detailed blueprints. We envision creating a state-of-the-art research and educational center that preserves both the archaeological site and the working aspects of your farm. The plans showed a thoughtfully designed complex that would blend into the valley's agricultural landscape while providing cutting-edge research facilities. Marcus Bennett, their bank manager, had been invited to the meeting and sat studying the proposals with growing enthusiasm. The bank's earlier concerns about the property's value had completely reversed. This kind of institutional investment would not only resolve the current financial situation, he explained, but would significantly increase the property's long-term value. The Smithsonian's proposal was comprehensive. They wanted to purchase development rights for the archaeological site and surrounding buffer zone, while leaving the Henderson family with ownership of the farm itself. The financial package included immediate funding for site development and research facilities, a generous annual lease payment for the research area, revenue sharing from future educational programs and tourism, grants for maintaining and modernizing the working farm, employment opportunities for family members who wished to be involved, college scholarship provisions for future Henderson generations. Sarah, her teacher's mind already racing with possibilities, asked about educational opportunities. Dr. Morrison's eyes lit up. "We're planning a significant educational component," she explained. "The site offers unique opportunities to teach about archaeology, ancient science, and agricultural history. We'd like to establish partnerships with local schools and universities." Michael, who had been quietly taking notes on his laptop, spoke up. "What about technology integration?" His computer science background saw possibilities beyond traditional archaeology. The combination of ancient advanced science and modern digital capabilities could create unique research opportunities. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the Smithsonian's technology director, nodded enthusiastically. "We're planning to create a digital research hub," she explained. "The site's significance extends beyond archaeology into physics, astronomy, and materials science. We want to build facilities that can support multidisciplinary research. The proposed research center would include advanced laboratories for artifact analysis, digital imaging and 3D modeling facilities, climate-controlled storage and preservation areas, educational spaces for public programs, virtual reality reconstruction capabilities, sustainable energy systems inspired by the site's ancient technology, agricultural research facilities combining traditional and modern methods. Local community leaders had been invited to an afternoon session to discuss broader implications. Mayor Thompson saw opportunities for regional development while keeping the valley's agricultural character intact. This could become a model for how to preserve both our farming heritage and embrace new opportunities, he noted. The economic projections were staggering. The research center would create dozens of direct jobs and hundreds of indirect opportunities. Local businesses would benefit from increased tourism and research-related activities. Property values throughout the valley would likely increase, though zoning protections would preserve the agricultural nature of the area. Dr. Morrison then revealed another exciting aspect of the proposal. "We've been in discussions with NASA," she announced. "They're very interested in the astronomical and mathematical aspects of the site. There's potential for collaborative research projects studying the advanced scientific knowledge encoded in the artifacts." The NASA connection opened up even more possibilities. Their experts were particularly intrigued by the sophisticated astronomical calculations found in the artifacts. "The precision of their celestial observations and mathematical models suggests capabilities we don't fully understand," explained Dr. James Wright. "This could influence our current space research methodologies." As the day progressed, more opportunities emerged. Universities expressed interest in establishing research partnerships. Technology companies inquired about studying the advanced metallurgical techniques. Agricultural research organizations saw potential in combining ancient and modern farming practices. For Jim and Sarah, it was almost overwhelming. Their struggling family farm was poised to become a globally significant research center. The financial pressures that had weighed so heavily on them were dissolving into opportunities they could hardly have imagined. Bobby Chen, who had been quietly supportive throughout the process, spoke up from his corner of the kitchen. "You know what this means for the community?" he asked. "This isn't just about preserving one farm or studying some artifacts. This is about creating a future that honors both our agricultural heritage and embraces new possibilities." The Smithsonian representatives outlined a phased development approach that would respect the farm's ongoing operations. The first phase would secure and study the immediate archaeological site. Later phases would gradually develop research and educational facilities while maintaining the property's agricultural character. As the Smithsonian team established their permanent presence at the Henderson farm, one mystery still remained: the strange metallic structure detected beneath the original discovery site. After weeks of careful preparation and documentation, Dr. Morrison's team was finally ready to begin a controlled excavation of the underground chamber. Jim, now fully recovered and actively involved in the site's development, stood with Sarah at the edge of the carefully gridded excavation area. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sophisticated equipment that surrounded the site. What had started with a collapsed shed and some mysterious artifacts had transformed into one of the most significant archaeological projects in North American history. The excavation proceeded with painstaking precision. Each layer of soil was carefully removed and documented, revealing more of the metallic structure beneath. By mid-morning, Dr. Patel, their metallurgist, called everyone over with barely contained excitement. "The alloy composition is identical to the medallions," he reported. "But the structure, it's like nothing we've ever seen." As more of the chamber was revealed, its purpose began to become clear. The walls were covered in the same mathematical symbols they'd found on the artifacts, but these were arranged in distinct patterns that seemed to respond to light in unusual ways. Dr. Sarah Chen, examining the patterns with specialized equipment, made a breakthrough discovery. "These aren't just symbols," she announced, her hands trembling as she showed them the readings. "They're some kind of data storage system. The molecular structure of the metal itself appears to encode information. It's like finding an ancient hard drive, but the technology behind it is, well, it shouldn't be possible." The chamber's contents proved even more extraordinary. At its center stood a device that appeared to be some kind of astronomical instrument. Dr. Wright's team identified it as an incredibly sophisticated celestial calculator, capable of tracking and predicting cosmic events with remarkable precision. But it was more than just an observational tool. It appeared to be part of a larger system for studying fundamental forces of the universe. News of these discoveries spread rapidly through the scientific community. The Henderson farm site wasn't just historically significant, it was revolutionizing multiple fields of science. The mathematical knowledge encoded in the artifacts and chamber walls was providing new insights into physics, astronomy, and engineering. For Jim and Sarah, watching their farm transform into a world-class research center brought both pride and amazement. The Smithsonian's development plans had preserved the property's agricultural character while creating state-of-the-art research facilities. Fields of corn and soybeans still stretched to the horizon, now managed with a fascinating blend of traditional farming wisdom and insights gained from studying the ancient agricultural knowledge encoded in the artifacts. Michael, their son, had found his own connection to the family legacy. His computer science skills proved invaluable in helping researchers analyze and understand the vast amount of data being gathered. He'd developed new software tools specifically designed to decode the mathematical patterns found in the artifacts, leading to breakthroughs in understanding the ancient technology. The local community had embraced the changes. The research center provided employment opportunities and educational programs that benefited the entire region. Other farmers in the valley had begun incorporating insights from the ancient agricultural practices discovered at the site, leading to more sustainable and productive farming methods. 1 year after the initial discovery, the Henderson Farm Archaeological Research Center officially opened its doors. The ceremony brought together an unlikely mixture of world-renowned scientists, local farmers, and government officials. Jim, standing at the podium to give his speech, looked out over the crowd with tears in his eyes. "A year ago," he began, "this farm was on the verge of becoming another statistic, another family farm lost to economic pressures. What we found beneath that old shed didn't just save our farm, it opened a window into a past we never knew existed. But more importantly, it showed us that progress doesn't mean having to choose between tradition and innovation." The research center had become a model for how to preserve agricultural heritage while advancing scientific knowledge. The original farmhouse, now restored and expanded, served as both the Henderson family home and an administrative center. The old barn had been transformed into a state-of-the-art laboratory while maintaining its traditional exterior appearance. Sarah had found her own role in the project, developing educational programs that brought students from across the country to learn about both archaeology and sustainable agriculture. Her science teaching background proved invaluable in helping translate complex scientific discoveries into understandable lessons for visitors of all ages. The financial struggles that had once threatened to end their family's farming legacy were now a distant memory. The Smithsonian's investment had not only secured the farm's future, but had created opportunities for future generations. A scholarship fund was established to support local students pursuing studies in archaeology, agricultural science, and related fields. Most remarkably, the ancient knowledge discovered on their farm was continuing to yield new insights. The mathematical formulas encoded in the artifacts had led to breakthroughs in quantum physics. The metallurgical techniques were inspiring new manufacturing processes. The astronomical calculations were contributing to NASA's space exploration efforts. As the sun set on the ceremony day, Jim and Sarah stood in their favorite spot on the farmhouse porch, watching researchers and farmers alike moving across their land. The gentle hum of sophisticated equipment mixed with the familiar sounds of agricultural life, a perfect symphony of past and future. "Remember when you first found that medallion?" Sarah asked, leaning against him. "Did you ever imagine it would lead to all this?" Jim smiled, thinking of how close they'd come to losing everything, only to become part of something far bigger than themselves. "Sometimes the greatest discoveries come when you've almost lost hope," he replied, squeezing her hand. The stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had guided the ancient scientists who had left their knowledge buried in this soil. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new challenges, and new opportunities. But for now, Jim and Sarah simply stood together, grateful for the twist of fate that had transformed their struggling farm into a bridge between ancient wisdom and future discovery.